Yeah, it's hard getting over something like that, Rodney. You're going to feel it for a while. Okay, hello everyone. This is the 5th Epical Revelation Fellowship. I'm Reverend Dr. Roger Paul, and today is November 3rd, 2013. And we're going to continue our study in paper 123, The Life of Christ, and section 5, School Days in Nazareth, and this is on page 1262-2, or paper 123-5-1. So let's say a little prayer and we'll get started. Got a lot to cover this morning. Rodney, why don't you say a prayer for us? Since you're back, glad to see Rodney's had a little health issue, and we're glad to have him back with us. So, why don't you go ahead and say a little prayer, Rodney?
Roger, if I could pass that on.
Oh, okay. I know I keep forgetting you have trouble breathing right now too. I'll say one. Father, thank you for bringing us together this morning, and thank you for this wonderful revelation you've given us, that we might learn about you and learn about your Son. We thank you for Rodney's recovery. We pray you'll help him get 100% again, and be in mind of Bill's wife, Henny, too. She's still having some issues. And we just want to pray that you'll bless all of our families, all those in need, that they might have a better life and an easier way of it through this life. Open our hearts and our minds this morning that we might learn something and take it with us and share it with others. And help us with our daily decisions, and help us with this ministry so we can know which direction to take it in. We thank you and we give you the praise in the name of your Son, Michael, Jesus of Nazareth. Amen. Okay, School Days in Nazareth. Linda, you want to start out reading and I'll take the next one?
Sure. I'm sorry, what page again?
Oh, 1362, Rodney.
1362.
Yeah.
Section 5.
Section 5, I think it's the second paragraph. School Days in Nazareth.
Okay.
Okay?
All right.
Jesus was now 7 years old, the age when Jewish children were supposed to begin their formal education in the synagogue schools. Accordingly, in August of this year, he entered upon the eventful school life at Nazareth. Already this lad was a fluent reader, writer, and speaker of 2 languages, Aramaic and Greek. He was now to acquaint himself with the task of learning to read, write, and speak the Hebrew language, and he was truly eager for the new school life which was ahead of him.
Okay, so this is one of the 3. To talk about the 3 languages he read, wrote, and spoke. That's Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew eventually, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
At 7 years old.
Yeah. Doing better than I do, I can tell you that. Get this going over here. Okay. For 3 years, until he was 10, he attended the elementary school in the Nazareth synagogue. For these 3 years, he studied the rudiments of the book of the law as it was recorded in the Hebrew tongue. For the following 3 years, he studied in the advanced school and committed to memory by the method of repeating aloud the deeper teachings of the sacred law. He graduated from the school of the synagogue during his 13th year and was turned over to the parents by the synagogue ruler as an educated son of the commandment, henceforth a responsible citizen of the Commonwealth of Israel, all of which entailed his attendance at the Passovers in Jerusalem. Accordingly, he attended his first Passover that year in company with his father and mother. So he went through school just like every other Jewish young man did, and at age 13 he was considered educated. Kind of interesting that we don't consider our children educated by 13, isn't it?
Well, and he didn't, the education system was learning the book of the law, the first 5 books of Moses.
By memory.
By memory. That's
right.
what he was that's how he was educated,
That's
not
right.
not like Western education.
That's right. All right.
Which is really interesting.
It is. Rodney, do you want to read or do you want to pass?
I can try this.
Okay.
At Nazareth, the pupils sat on the floor in a semicircle, while their teacher, the Shazam,
Shazam. Yeah.
scriptures in Hebrew. Nothing but the scriptures was studied prior to the 12th year. In the summer months, the hours for school were greatly shortened.
Okay, so they would
So they
read.
went to school year round.
Pardon me?
They went to school year round.
They did. They did. And they were shortened for the summer months, I guess, so they could help their families and the gardening and that sort of thing, right? Right. And they studied the books of the law, right, from the Hebrew scriptures.
The book of Leviticus is intense.
Yes, it is. So, and they did this by rote memorization, remember? So, you know, this is no easy task trying to memorize this stuff. Okay.
Jesus early became a master of Hebrew, and as a young man, when no visitor of prominence happened to be sojourning in Nazareth, he would often be asked to read the Hebrew scriptures to the faithful assembled in the synagogue at the regular Sabbath services.
Okay, so they heard Jesus many times during these readings as a young man speaking, didn't they? All right. These synagogue schools, of course, had no textbooks. In teaching, the Sajan would utter a statement while the pupils would in unison repeat it after him. When having access to the written books of the law, the student learned his lessons by reading aloud and by constant repetition. That's kind of interesting.
So the law was ingrained in his mind
Yes.
completely.
Yeah, by the time he was grown, he
13.
memorized everything. That's
Right.
why, remember later on in life when he's teaching, he says, remember it says in such and such?
Yeah.
Or remember it says in such and such? You know, he was taught well. You know, he remembered it from his own experience.
Right,
Right?
right.
That's it. That experiential knowledge, as they say.
And
right?
you know, I think it's really interesting because as young people, we all know the way that we grew up and what we were taught when we grew up. But you know, the law are the guardrails around us
Mhm.
to keep us on the right track.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to me that this was ingrained in him as a young child.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting.
The other interesting thing is, what do we ingrain in our own children?
Well, see, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
What do we teach them? And you know, I mean, we all know, you know, we can't talk about God in school, and
Yeah.
you know, we remove all you know, reference to anything about God and the Father and prayer and all of that.
Let me give you a supposed, okay? Supposed that you took this book, this revelation, and started teaching your children from as soon as they understood writing, you know, all the way up their life, and you did it just like the Hebrews did to their young people, you know, repetition over and over. By the time they become an adult, they would be so fluent in this, they would know exactly everything,
Right.
wouldn't they? You know?
Start teaching them the life of Christ.
The life of Christ. Start
they're,
out with when
you know,
they're
6 years old, 5
yeah,
years old.
exactly. And then
Soon
you
as-
move on as they get a little older. You move on to the bigger and the other things, right? A little bit at a time. Okay. You want to take the next one?
Let's see here. Next, in addition to his more formal schooling, Jesus began. Am I in the right place? Jesus began to make contact with human nature from the four quarters of the earth as men from many lands passed in and out of his father's repair shop. When he grew older, he mingled freely with the caravans as they tarried near the spring for rest and nourishment. Being a fluent speaker of Greek, he had little trouble in conversing with the majority of the caravan travelers and conductors, because that was the language of the world at that time.
That's right. And you remember he was given a copy of the Greek Hebrew scriptures too, right? As a boy. That's what the Alexandrians gave them before they left, right? So he had that at home for years to start his learning of reading and writing. It was Greek, right? All right. Nazareth was a caravan way station and a crossroads of travel and largely Gentile in population. At the same time, it was widely known as a center of liberal interpretation of Jewish traditional law. In Galilee, the Jews mingled more freely with the Gentiles than with their practice in Judea. And of all the cities of Galilee, the Jews of Nazareth were most liberal in their interpretation of the social restrictions based on the fears of contamination as the result of contact with the Gentiles. And these conditions gave rise to the common saying in Jerusalem, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Now, think about this. They already had prejudices set up, didn't they?
Sure.
Because they felt like if you talked or touched to a Gentile, then you were contaminated, right?
Right.
And
According to the Pharisees in Jerusalem.
according to the Pharisees in Jerusalem, right? And they also interpreted the law a little more liberal than they did in other parts of Judea, didn't they?
Right.
Okay, so that meant they were probably a little more open-minded, not quite as closed-minded. So when Jesus started going to Jerusalem and talking to the Sadducees and Pharisees, he already was at a disadvantage, wasn't he? Because he had an open mind, where they already had a closed mind to start out with, right? This is the way it is, it can be no other. Now, who in our time has that same concept? That's what the Christians took over, didn't they? If you think about it. When you talk to people about reading the Bible and interpreting the Bible, many Christian sects have said, this is the way it is, this is the way of God, it can't vary, right? And in Jesus' time, it would be, this is the same sort of thing that the Pharisees would have taken up, wouldn't they? Right? The same attitudes, right? So we have the same thing going on today. All right. Let's see. Who's next? Rodney? Would you
Jesus received his moral training in spiritual culture chiefly in his own home. He secured much of his intellectual and theological education from the Shazam. But his real education, that equipment of mind and heart for the actual test of grappling with the difficult problems of life, he obtained by mingling with his fellow men. It was this close association with his fellow men, young and old, Jew and Gentile, that afforded him the opportunity to know the human race. Jesus was highly educated, and that he thoroughly understood men and devoutly loved them.
So where he was and the situation he was in give him a great opportunity to become more open-minded, more accepting of the people around him, didn't it?
And of course, this is why he was born on earth in that particular situation, because of the crossroads of the known world at that time.
That's right. And then there would be there was a spiritual flowering of all the concepts of God during that period of time too, wasn't there, Rodney?
Right.
You think about it. Okay. You take the next one.
Throughout his years at the synagogue, he was a brilliant student, possessing a great advantage since he was conversant with three languages: the Nazareth Chazan,
Shazam.
Yep.
Shazam.
On the occasion of Jesus' finishing the course in his school, remarked to Joseph that he feared he had learned more from Jesus' searching questions than he had been able to teach the lad.
I could imagine that would be so, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. He's trying to figure it out.
He's trying to figure out what was going on, right? Alright. Throughout this course of study, Jesus learned much and derived great inspiration from the regular Sabbath sermons in the synagogue. It was customary to ask distinguished visitors stopping over the Sabbath in Nazareth to address the synagogue. As Jesus grew up and heard many great thinkers of the entire Jewish world expound their views, and many also who were hardly Orthodox Jews, since the synagogue of Nazareth was an advanced and liberal center of Hebrew thought and culture. Now, I want to bring something up here that's obvious but not obvious, and that is what? Every Sabbath, Jesus was what?
Greatly inspired
In the synagogue.
in the synagogue.
Right.
Right.
So he went to where every Sunday? Church. Well,
Saturday.
Saturday.
Right,
Yeah,
the
every
Sabbath.
Saturday.
That's why I looked at you,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I was thinking
Yeah,
Saturday.
it was Saturday back then.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
So he was our example, right?
And it says he derived great inspiration.
Great inspiration from going to services every single week,
Yeah.
right? He didn't say he sat home and watched football, did he?
No.
He didn't say he sat home because he had to take care of the kids, did he? No, he didn't say he had to sit home because he had to study for tomorrow's exam, did he? Every Saturday he was in the synagogue.
I'm sure his whole family was there.
His whole family was there, right? He was in some sort of what? Church,
That's right.
right? You can call it whatever you want to. You can call it a temple, a church, whatever.
A synagogue.
But he spent some time every week devoted to attending some sort of worship of God, didn't he?
It was the regular Sabbath sermons in the synagogue.
Right. Too bad you Ranchins are so against going to church, aren't they? What's going on?
Well,
there?
you know, and the big takeaway from this here is he derived great inspiration.
Great
he
inspiration.
was inspired by
That's
by
right.
going and hearing, you know, the sermons and the great thinkers and
That's
the
what it's all
teachers.
about, right?
That's exactly what it's all about.
Recharging your battery for the rest
For
of the
the
week.
rest of the week.
That's right.
That's
right.
right.
I just wanted to bring that up. It's obvious but not so obvious, right?
Yeah.
So Jesus didn't sit home on Sunday or Saturday morning and say, "Woe is me! I'm not going to church today because I got something better to do." Right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. My turn?
I think it's.
Is it Rod? Is it your turn,
I think
Rodney?
it's your turn, Rodney.
Okay. When entering the school at 7 years, parenthesis at this time, the Jews had just inaugurated a compulsory education law, close parenthesis. It was customary for the pupils to choose their birthday text, a sort of golden rule to guide them throughout their studies, one upon which they often, what's that word?
Expatiated.
Expatiated
Yep.
at their graduation when 13 years old. The text which Jesus chose was from the prophet Isaiah. Quote, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the meek, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and to set the spiritual prisoners free."
Well, he picked this perfect scripture, didn't he? Right? Because that's exactly what he did. He was the anointed one, right? And this is a picture of what the scriptures may have looked at during that time, basically. Okay? All right.
Nazareth was one of 24 priest centers of the Hebrew nation. Oh, I guess I didn't know that. But the Galilean priesthood was more liberal in the interpretation of the traditional laws than were the Judean scribes and rabbis. And at Nazareth they were also more liberal regarding the observance of the Sabbath. It was therefore the custom for Joseph to take Jesus out on walks on Sabbath afternoons, one of their favorite jaunts being to climb the high hill near their home, from which they could obtain a panoramic view of all Galilee. To the northwest, on clear days, they could see the long ridge of Mount Carmel running down to the sea, and many times Jesus heard his father relate the story of Elijah, one of the first of that long line of Hebrew prophets who reproved Ahab and exposed the priests of Baal. To the north, Mount Hermon raised its snowy peak in majestic splendor and monopolized the skyline, almost 3,000 feet of the upper slopes glistening with perpetual snow, glistening white with perpetual snow. Far to the east they could discern the Jordan Valley, and far beyond the rocky hills of Moab. Also, to the south and east, when the sun shone upon their marble walls, they could see the Greco-Roman cities of the Decapolis with their amphitheaters and pretentious temples.
Okay, so Nazareth was one of 24 priestly centers, wasn't it? Wasn't it, of the Hebrew nation? Even though it wasn't thought well of, right, by the others, because they did, snootiness, I guess. Okay, but they were also more liberal regarding the observance of the Sabbath. Now, how is that? That meant they could walk around a little more freely, not have to count their steps going to and from the temple and that sort of thing, right? And doing this as a young man, Jesus heard the stories that his father told him about Elijah, Ahab, Baal, things like that. Also, I have some pictures of Nazareth that I thought might be interesting. This is Nazareth today, coming into the city, all right? And just works. This is another view of it. This is the possible precipice they were talking about. Jesus, the temple was going to throw him off of, when they rushed him to the edge. This is one of the few around Nazareth, so it's a good possibility. And this is a map of the area, and this is Nazareth right here in the center. And you can see Mount Carmel, which they talked about in this slide. Okay, and you can also see some other interesting things that surround Nazareth to kind of give you an idea of where everyone is. You can see the Sea of Galilee to the right, and I just thought it was interesting. I thought I'd throw it in there for y'all to look at your leisure. Okay. All right. From the four directions, Jesus could observe the caravan trails as they wended their way in and out of Nazareth to the south. He could overlook the broad and fertile plain country of Esdraelon, searching off toward Mount Gilboa and Samaria. Let me go back here just one slide, and also show you one thing. These are the caravan trails, I believe, here. Okay, and then you can see the Mount Carmel and that sort of thing. So you can look at that later. Here is another map, and here's Nazareth again, and this is Mount Gilboa they talk about in this slide. Okay, down here. So one's up here, the other mountain he could see up there, and he could see all these clearly from, I don't know if you can see this because it's barely outlined there, but these are all like a little mountain range that Nazareth sits right in the middle of. So he could get up high and look out at these different places, right? Which is kind of neat.
That's where Armageddon was fought, right there in the Jezreel Valley.
That's right. It was. Battle of Armageddon, which already happened, right? We keep trying to say it's coming yet, but it's already happened. Okay. Advance this a little bit, and we'll keep going. All right, Rodney, would you take the next one?
They did not climb the heights to view the distant landscape. They strolled through the countryside and studied nature in her various moods in accordance with the seasons. Jesus' earliest training, aside from that of the home work, had to do with a reverent and sympathetic contact with nature.
So even Jesus strolled the mountains and the pathways and observed nature just like we all can, right? All right.
Before he was 8 years old, he was known to all the mothers and young women of Nazareth who had met him and talked with him at the spring, which was not far from his home, and which was one of the social centers of contact and gossip for the entire town. This year, Jesus learned to milk the family cow and care for the other animals. During this and the following year, he also learned to make cheese and to weave. When he was 10 years of age, he was an expert loom operator. It was about this time that Jesus and the neighbor boy Jacob became great friends of the potter who worked near the flowing spring. As they watched Nathan's deft fingers mold the clay on the potter's wheel. Many times, both of them determined to be potters when they grew up. Nathan was very fond of the lads and often gave them clay to play with, seeking to stimulate their creative imaginations by suggesting competitive efforts in modeling various objects and animals.
Maybe that's where Jesus got the tendency to draw pictures and make things he got in trouble at school at, right? You know, they were
Making idols.
that making idols, being a good Jew, he was not supposed to do that, right? You know, so, but it mentions here Jacob again, his defender, right? Which is interesting too. All right, the 8th year. Get your right slide here. This was an interesting year at school. Although Jesus was not an unusual student, he was a diligent pupil and belonged to the more progressive third of the class, doing his work so well that he was excused from attendance 1 week out of each month. This week he usually spent either with his fisherman uncle on the shores of the Sea of Galilee near Magdala, or on the farm of another uncle, his mother's brother, 5 miles south of Nazareth. And we saw these in another slide last week, if you remember. And the next slide is 82. Okay? The calendars I put in there for y'all. Find the days and things as we go through here. Okay. Rodney, if you didn't hear this from last week, I've taken 81 through 40 and made calendars for each year, and I'm incorporating them into these slides when they bring them up. All right? So you can see what day of the week it was if you'd like to. Okay? All right. Rodney, would you take the next one?
Although his mother had become unduly anxious about his health and safety, she gradually became reconciled to these trips away from home. Jesus' uncles and aunts were all very fond of him, and there ensued a lively competition among them to secure his company for these monthly visits throughout this and immediately subsequent years. His first week's sojourn in his uncle's farm, since infancy, was in January of this year. The first week's fishing experience on the Sea of Galilee occurred in the month of May.
So this was when Jesus made his first introduction to fishing, wasn't it?
Right.
Okay. Take the next one.
About this time, Jesus met a teacher of mathematics from Damascus, and learning some new techniques of numbers, he spent much time on mathematics for several years. He developed a keen sense of numbers, distances, and proportions.
I would think so, since he was the creator of the universe. Yeah. I would think that would be pretty important. Okay. Jesus began to enjoy his brother James very much, and by the end of the year, he had begun teaching him the alphabet. You know, so Jesus started out like a teacher, just like we're supposed to be, right? Let me go ahead and take the next one too, since that was so short. This year, Jesus made arrangements to exchange dairy products for lessons on the harp. He had an unusual liking for everything musical. Later on, he did much to promote an interest in vocal music among his youthful associates. By the time he was 11 years of age, he was a skillful harpist and greatly enjoyed entertaining both family and friends with his extraordinary interpretations and able improvisations. So he was a musician too. You don't think about Jesus being a musician, did you?
A harp is a beautiful instrument.
Okay. I didn't advance the other one, did I? Okay, Ronnie, would you take the next one?
Now, Jesus continued to make invaluable progress in school. All did not run smoothly for either parents or teachers. He persisted in asking many embarrassing questions concerning both science and religion, particularly astronomy. He was especially insistent on finding out why there was a dry season and a rainy season in Palestine. Repeatedly, he sought the explanation for the great difference between the temperatures of Nazareth and the Jordan Valley. He simply never ceased to ask such intelligent but perplexing questions.
Okay, so like many youths, he was a big question mark, wasn't he? Okay? And being a big question mark, he had lots and lots of things he wanted answers to. And our children are the same way today, right? The problem is when we get so closed-minded that we don't keep our minds open to science and art and geography, astronomy, and things like that, then we lose an opportunity to teach them properly, don't we?
And we also don't encourage this either.
And we don't encourage it either, that's right.
We consider, questions that, that's disruptive.
Disruptive to everybody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually because it's disruptive because they're questions that people have problems answering themselves.
Especially in a classroom.
Especially in a classroom. Okay, you want to take the next two?
Sure.
Because this one's really short too.
His third brother Simon was born on Friday evening, April 14th of this year, AD 2. In February, Nahor, one of the teachers in a Jerusalem Academy of the Rabbis, came to Nazareth to observe Jesus, having been on a similar mission to Zacharias' home near Jerusalem. He came to Nazareth at the instigation of John's father. While at first he was somewhat shocked by Jesus' frankness and unconventional manner of relating himself to things religious, he attributed it to the remoteness of Galilee and the centers of Hebrew learning and culture, and advised Joseph and Mary to allow him to take Jesus back with him to Jerusalem, where he could have the advantages of education and training at the center of Jewish culture. Mary was half persuaded to consent. She was convinced her eldest son was to become the Messiah, the Jewish deliverer. Joseph hesitated. He was equally persuaded that Jesus was to grow up to become a man of destiny, but what that destiny would prove to be, he was profoundly uncertain. But he never really doubted that his son was to fulfill some great mission on earth. The more he thought about Nahor's advice, the more he questioned the wisdom of the proposed sojourn in Jerusalem.
Okay, so we got a Jewish rabbi, Nahor, that comes to visit and sees the potential in Jesus, right? And of course it'd be a feather in his cap to take him back to Jerusalem, as his new prize student, right, or pupil, right? So he's trying to convince him that he needs to go back to Jerusalem where the culture is better so that he can learn properly and that sort of thing. And Mary was all for this, right? But Joseph, his father, was not so sure that that's the direction that he needed to be taught. So there come this battle up between them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's go to the next paragraph and we'll see what happens here. Give me 1 second. Okay. Because of this difference of opinion between Joseph and Mary, Nahor requested permission to lay the whole matter before Jesus. Jesus listened attentively, talking with Joseph, Mary, and a neighbor, Jacob, the stonemason, whose son was his favorite playmate, and then 2 days later reported that since there was such a difference of opinion among his parents and advisors, and since he did not feel competent to assume the responsibility for such a decision, not feeling strongly one way or the other, in view of the whole situation, he had finally decided to talk to my Father who is in heaven. And while he was not perfectly sure about the answer, sounds like us, doesn't it, sometimes, he rather felt he should remain at home with my father and mother, adding, "They who love me so much should be able to do more for me and guide me more safely than strangers who can only view my body and observe my mind, but can hardly truly know me." They all marveled, and Nahor went his way back to Jerusalem. And it was many years before the subject of Jesus going away from home again came up for consideration. So he thought about it with all the advice and everything, and talked to God about it, and decided he was better off staying at home. So that was the final decision, right? And that ends paper 123. Next one's 124. Let's shut down the video and we'll get ready for our next meeting. Okay. Let's have a little prayer before we quit.
Okay.
Linda, you want to say the prayer for us?
Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this revelation that you've given us, and the restatement of the life of Jesus. We just ask that you will help us to understand these things as they apply to our life and as they apply to our own personal service and ministry throughout this week. We ask that you would bless us all, keep us safe, just give us strength and courage to continue to follow you and seek your will. We give you all glory, honor, and praise, Father, for this wonderful revelation and for your Son, Jesus Christ Michael. It's in his name that we pray these things. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for joining us. God bless you.